The sky burned green, and the Galactic Council left us to die. We watched their pristine dreadnoughts jump to light speed, abandoning our world to the slaughter. They calculated the margins, deemed us a lost cause, and simply walked away. We were out of ammo, out of time, and entirely out of hope. Then the radar pinged. Not with the sleek, elegant signatures of our so-called allies, but with the crude, brutal mass of something else. Something angry. The humans hadn't been invited to this war, but they came anyway. Garrick watched the orbital tethers burn. They fell like dying stars, streaks of blinding white carving through the bruised purple sky of New Providence. He didn't blink. Blinking meant acknowledging the ash stinging his eyes, and acknowledging the ash meant accepting that his city was currently drifting down around him in microscopic, incinerated flakes. "They're gone, Commander." The voice belonged to Finch. It was flat. Stripped of panic. Stripped of hope. It was the voice of a man who had just checked his bank account and realized he couldn't afford a lifeline. Garrick slowly lowered his macro binoculars. He didn't need them to see the gaping absence in the upper atmosphere. 10 minutes ago, the Coalition fleet had formed a glittering defensive perimeter above the planet. 300 ships. Shields humming with enough captured stellar energy to boil an ocean. They had been the cavalry. The promise that the Galactic Mandate looked after its own. Then the Vulture Swarm had breached the outer system. A hive fleet so massive its gravitational wake pulled minor moons out of orbit. The Coalition Admiral hadn't even broadcast a retreat order to the surface. There was no "hold the line," no "we will return." Just a sudden, synchronized flash of slipspace ruptures, and the sky was empty. They ran. A simple cost-benefit analysis executed in the cold vacuum of space. New Providence was a mining colony. Rich in iridium, sure, but not rich enough to trade 300 capital ships for. "I see it, Finch," Garrick said, his voice tasting of copper and dust. They stood in the ruins of Outpost Delta, a concrete blister on the ridge overlooking the capital. Below them, the city of Arcadia was a meat grinder. Pillars of black smoke choked the horizon. The defensive grid had failed an hour ago. Now it was just infantry fighting house to house, street to street, dying in the dark so the politicians on core worlds could sleep with a clear conscience. "Comms are dead," Logan muttered from the back of the bunker. He kicked a shattered console. The metal groaned in protest. Not jammed. Dead. The relay stations went down when the orbital tethers collapsed. "We're entirely cut off." Garrick turned to look at his squad. There were 12 of them left out of a platoon of 50. Their armor was scorched, ceramic plates cracked and spiderwebbed with laser scoring. Harper was bleeding through a makeshift tourniquet on her left thigh. Miller was staring at a blank datapad, his eyes glazed, lips moving in a silent, repetitive prayer to a god that had clearly booked the first transport out of the system. "Ammo count," Garrick ordered. The squad shifted. The routine of protocol offered a tiny, fleeting anchor in the madness. "2 thermal mags," Finch said, patting his chest rig. "Half a belt for the heavy repeater," Logan grunted. "Maybe 50 rounds. After that, I'm throwing rocks." "Sidearm only," Harper winced, shifting her weight off her bad leg. 3 clips. Garrick looked down at his own rifle. The indicator light blinked a weak, pulsing yellow. 30% charge, enough to kill maybe 10 vultures if he hit the ocular clusters perfectly. Not nearly enough for what was coming. "All right," Garrick said. He stepped away from the viewing slit and walked to the center of the bunker. The reinforced ferrocrete vibrated beneath his boots. The vultures were landing. You didn't need sensors to know it. You could feel it in the bedrock. The rhythmic, thudding impacts of their drop spores slamming into the planet's crust. "We hold the ridge. If they take Delta, they have a clear firing line down into the civilian evacuation shelters in Sector 4. Finch let out a dry, hacking laugh. Shelters! Commander, the planetary shields are gone. The fleet is gone. The vultures are going to crack those shelters like walnuts. We aren't buying them time to escape. We're just deciding what order we all die in. Garrick closed the distance between them, grabbing Finch by the collar of his tactical vest. The fabric was stiff with dried blood. Then we die in the right order. Garrick snarled, his voice a low, gravelly threat. We die standing between them and the people who can't fight. We die making them pay for every inch of dirt. You want to lie down and wait for the end? Do it outside. Not in my bunker. Finch stared back. His eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by pale, dirt-caked skin. For a second, Garrick thought the younger soldier might swing at him. Then the tension broke. Finch sagged, nodding slowly. Sorry, Commander, I thought they'd hold. The coalition. I thought we meant something to them. Garrick released him, smoothing out the wrinkled vest. We mean a decimal point on a ledger, Finch. When the math didn't add up, they balanced the books. That's the universe we live in. A low, guttural shriek echoed up the ridge. It was a sound that scraped against the inside of the skull, a biological siren that promised violence and consumption. The vultures. They weren't scavengers, despite the name the grunts had given them. They were an apex, predatory collective. Biomechanical nightmares wrapped in chitin armor, driven by a localized hive mind. They didn't negotiate. They didn't take prisoners. They stripped worlds down to the bedrock and moved on. Positions, Garrick snapped. The squad moved. Exhaustion was pushed down, replaced by the cold, mechanical necessity of survival. Logan hauled the heavy repeater to the sandbagged embrasure on the left flank. Harper limped to the right, bracing her sidearm on a shattered chunk of pillar. Finch and the others filled the gaps, checking sights, clicking safeties off. Garrick took the center. He looked through the sight of his rifle. Through the swirling smoke and falling ash, movement registered at the base of the hill. At first, it looked like a dark fluid, spilling up the incline, defying gravity. Then the optics resolved the image. Thousands of them. Sleek, multi-limbed horrors, their exoskeletons the color of bruised iron. They moved with terrifying synchronization, vaulting over the wreckage of destroyed hover tanks, scrambling up the steep scree with terrifying speed. Hold fire until they hit the first line of razor wire, Garrick ordered. His earpiece crackled with static, the ghost of a dead comms network. The silence in the bunker was absolute, save for the ragged breathing of terrified soldiers and the approaching thunder of claws on rock. Garrick felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He wasn't afraid of dying. He had made peace with that the day he put on the uniform. He was afraid of failing. He was afraid of the screams that would echo from the civilian shelters once the line broke. He looked at the sky one last time. Empty. Cold. Indifferent. Here they come, Logan whispered. The leading edge of the swarm hit the razor wire. The wire, monomolecular and charged with high voltage, sliced through the first dozen vultures like a hot knife through butter. Sparks showered the hillside as chitin gave way to screaming electricity. But they didn't stop. The dead became bridges for the living. The swarm poured over their own casualties, burying the defensive line under a tide of bodies. Fire! Garrick roared. The bunker erupted. The noise was absolute. It compressed the air inside the bunker, punching at Garrick's chest with physical force. Logan's heavy repeater spat a solid line of tracer fire into the dark. The rapid thud, thud, thud vibrating through the floorboards. Where the heavy round struck, Vultures exploded in sprays of caustic blue fluid and shattered armor, but for every one that fell, 3 more vaulted over the pulverized remains. Garrick fired in controlled bursts. Center mass. Adjust. Squeeze. A vulture lunged over the trench lip, its mandibles snapping wide to reveal rows of serrated bone. Garrick put a thermal round through its open mouth. The creature's head snapped back, internal fluids boiling instantly, and it slumped dead against the sandbags. "Left flank!" Harper screamed over the din. "They're flanking the wire!" Garrick shifted his aim. A cluster of leaner, faster variants, skittering on 6 legs instead of 4, were scaling the sheer rock face on the left, bypassing the choke point. "Finch, with me. Logan, keep the main push pinned." Garrick and Finch rushed to the left embrasure. Garrick leaned out, exposing his shoulder, and fired down the rock wall. The plasma bolts sheared off chunks of stone and chitin. Finch threw a fragmentation grenade. It bounced off a jagged outcropping and detonated in mid-air. The shockwave blew 6 vultures off the wall, sending them tumbling hundreds of feet down into the burning valley. "We can't hold this!" Finch yelled, ducking back as a volley of organic spikes slammed into the ferrocrete where his head had been a second before. The spikes sizzled, eating through the concrete with a highly acidic coating. "We hold until we are dead, Finch. That's the only job we have left." Garrick checked his rifle. 15%. He was burning through his battery too fast. Down in the valley, Arcadia was dying. Garrick could see the brilliant flashes of plasma detonations leveling entire city blocks. The vultures had unleashed their siege breakers, massive, lumbering beasts that functioned as living artillery, lobbing globs of hypercorrosive plasma into the defensive grids. The sky was lit with a hellish, strobing glare. He thought of the galactic mandate, the pristine ivory towers on the core worlds, the politicians sitting in climate-controlled amphitheaters, drinking synthesized wine and debating the strategic value of billions of lives. They had probably already drafted the press release. A tragic loss, a necessary tactical withdrawal. Our hearts go out to the brave martyrs of New Providence. The utter, sickening hypocrisy of it made Garrick's blood boil. They didn't care. The universe was a brutal, pragmatic machine. And humanity. Wait, no. Garrick wasn't human. He was a colonist of the frontier, a citizen of the fringe. He had seen humans before, though. Mercenaries, mostly. Rough, uncompromising bastards who drank too much and fought too hard. The mandate looked down on them, called them primitive, unrefined, kept them locked out of the core systems, relegated to the very edge of civilized space. "Jam!" Logan shouted, frantically racking the charging handle of the heavy repeater. "Barrels fused. I need 3 seconds. Cover him," Garrick ordered. The pause in the heavy fire was all the vultures needed. The swarm surged forward, breaching the final line of wire. They poured into the outer trench. Miller screamed. A vulture the size of a Land Rover leaped over the sandbags, pinning him to the ground. Its scythe-like forelegs drove through Miller's chest plate as if it were paper. The sound of crunching bone cut through the gunfire. "Miller!" Harper shrieked, firing her sidearm wildly into the beast's flank. The rounds pinged uselessly off its thick carapace. Garrick stepped up, pressed the muzzle of his rifle against the weak point behind the creature's armored neck, and pulled the trigger. The rifle whined, expelled a massive thermal charge, and died. Indicator light black. The vulture spasmed and collapsed off Miller, dead. Garrick dropped the useless rifle and drew his sidearm. He knelt next to Miller. The soldier's eyes were wide, staring at the ceiling. Blood bubbled at his lips. He was gone. "We've lost the outer trench," Finch yelled, backpedaling into the main bunker doorway. They were collapsing inward. The 12 were now 8. The bunker was an enclosed tomb. No back door, no retreat. "Seal the blast doors." Garrick ordered quietly. "Commander, if we seal them, we're trapped," Logan said, finally getting his sidearm drawn, abandoning the ruined repeater. "If we don't seal them, we die in 30 seconds. Seal them!" Logan hit the manual override. The heavy steel doors groaned, protesting against dirt and rust, before slamming shut with a final, resonant boom. The magnetic locks engaged with a heavy clack. Silence descended on the bunker, thick and heavy. Outside, the scraping began. The vultures were clawing at the blast doors. The screech of biological steel on reinforced durasteel set Garrick's teeth on edge. It sounded like a million knives dragging across glass. Then came the hissing. Acid. They were melting the doors. Garrick looked at his remaining squad. Harper was sitting against the back wall, applying a fresh bandage to her leg, her face pale and sweaty. Finch was staring at the door, his pistol shaking in his hand. Logan was checking his magazines. 4 men, 3 women. All dead. They just had to wait for the door to give way. "How long?" Harper asked softly. 10 minutes, Garrick lied. The acid was already eating through the outer layer. The door was turning a dull, angry orange in the center. 5, maybe. Finch slid down the wall, resting his head against his knees. "I just wanted to see the ocean. I saved up 3 years of hazard pay. Was going to transfer to the water world of Oakhaven. Sit on a beach." "It's overrated," Logan said grimly. "Sand gets everywhere." Garrick checked his pistol. 12 rounds. He looked at the door. The orange spot was growing, turning white-hot. The steel was blistering. "It was an honor, Commander," Logan said, not looking up. "The honor was mine," Garrick replied. He meant it. They had fought like demons. They had held the line as long as the laws of physics allowed. The center of the door gave way with a wet shuck. A hole the size of a fist opened, and a vulture thrust its serrated limb through, blindly grasping for flesh. Logan raised his pistol and blew the limb off. The creature shrieked outside. "Here they come!" Garrick said, raising his weapon. The metal groaned, warping inward. The hinges were failing. The locks were melting. The door buckled, preparing to blow inward and unleash the tide. Then the ground stopped shaking. The scraping stopped. The shrieking stopped. Garrick frowned, his gun trained on the melting door. The sudden silence outside was more terrifying than the noise. A low, deep rumble began to vibrate through the floor. It wasn't the frantic, chaotic drumming of the swarm. It was a sustained, mechanical bass note. It grew louder, rattling the loose bolts in the walls. The sound of atmospheric entry. Heavy, unshielded atmospheric entry. "Commander," Finch whispered, looking at the ceiling. "Quiet." The rumble built into a deafening roar. It sounded like the sky itself was tearing apart. Then the shock waves hit. 1, 2, 3, 4. Massive, earth-shattering impacts that threw Garrick off his feet. The bunker pitched violently. Dust showered from the ceiling. Outside, through the tiny melted hole in the door, a flash of blinding light illuminated the hillside, followed by a concussive blast that bowed the heavy steel door inward. "Orbital strikes?" Logan yelled, scrambling up. "Did the coalition come back?" Garrick dragged himself to the viewing slit. He wiped the dirt from his eyes and peered out over the valley. The sky wasn't filled with the elegant, glowing teardrops of coalition drop ships. The sky was filled with falling anvils. They were ugly. There was no grace in their design, no aerodynamic elegance. They were brutal, blocky chunks of ablative armor and raw thruster power, dropping through the atmosphere like bricks wrapped in hellfire. They didn't glide, they plummeted. The heat shields burned a furious, blinding white. shedding layers of ablative ceramic that trailed behind them like dirty comets. "What in God's name are those?" Finch breathed, crowding in next to Garrick at the viewing slit. "Drop pods," Garrick said, his voice hushed. He had never seen anything like them. Coalition troops deployed via anti-grav elevators, stepping onto the battlefield clean and rested. These things looked like they were designed to punish whatever was inside them, just as much as whatever they landed on. Down in the valley, the swarm had paused. The hive mind, encountering a variable it couldn't instantly process, halted its advance on the civilian shelters. Millions of vultures turned their armored heads upward, tracking the falling debris. The first pod hit the ground 300 yards from Garrick's bunker, right in the center of a dense vulture pack. The impact cratered the earth, throwing a geyser of rock and pulverized chitin 50 feet into the air. The shockwave flattened the aliens in a 100-yard radius. Before the dust could even settle, the explosive bolts on the pod's doors blew. 4 heavy steel slabs kicked outward, crushing the staggering vultures that had survived the landing. Through the smoke, shadows moved. Large shadows. "Coalition?" Harper asked, leaning heavily on Logan as she limped to the slit. "No," Garrick said, squinting. "Look at the ships breaking orbit. High above, the cloud cover parted, torn asunder by the raw thermal output of the arriving fleet. They were massive, not sleek cruisers of polished silver and energy shields, but jagged, brutalist slabs of dark grey metal. They bristled with physical armor plating, entirely devoid of elegant energy barriers. They looked like floating fortresses, belching black smoke and radiation. Huge red block letters were painted on the side of the closest dreadnought. Letters Garrick couldn't read, but recognized the aesthetic of. "Terran Systems Alliance," Logan breathed. "Those are humans." "Humans?" Finch scoffed. "They aren't part of the mandate. They don't have jurisdiction here. They don't even have a seat on the council." "Tell that to them," Garrick said. Down in the valley, the shadows stepping from the drop pods resolved into the light. They were clad in bulky, utilitarian power armor, scarred and scuffed with the wear of 100 brutal campaigns. There were no shining energy halos, no ceremonial capes, just thick plates of matte green and gunmetal grey, strapped with excessive amounts of kinetic ammunition. The swarm recovered quickly. The hive mind recognized the threat and shrieked its command. The tide of chitin and acid turned, flooding toward the solitary drop pod. The leading human didn't raise a sophisticated plasma rifle. He hoisted an absolute monster of a weapon, a rotary cannon that looked like it belonged mounted on a tank, not held by infantry. The human braced his boots in the dirt, planted the weapon against his hip, and opened fire. The sound was a continuous, deafening brrrr. A solid beam of depleted uranium rounds tore into the approaching swarm. The effect was completely different from the clean, cauterizing burns of plasma. Kinetic energy didn't burn, it shattered, it pulverized. The front lines of the vultures simply disintegrated, turned into a fine mist of blue blood and bone shrapnel. The human didn't aim. He swept the weapon back and forth like a man hosing down a filthy driveway. "Good God," Logan whispered. More pods slammed into the earth. 50, 100, 500. The valley floor was suddenly carpeted with craters, smoke, and pissed-off apes. The vulture siege breakers, the massive artillery beasts, turned their attention to the new threat. A beast near the city limits reared back, its biological mortar sacks pulsing with hypercorrosive plasma, aiming for a cluster of freshly landed human pods. Before it could fire, a shadow swept over the valley. A human gunship broke through the clouds. It wasn't hovering elegantly on anti-grav repulsors. It was screaming through the air on massive, inefficient twin rotors, banking hard. It didn't drop a precision-guided smart bomb. It just unleashed a torrent of unguided rockets from its stub wings. The barrage hammered the siege breaker in a chain of concussive explosions, blowing its legs off and leaving it a thrashing, smoking ruin. They're not fighting a war, Garrick realized aloud, his eyes wide. What do you mean? Harper asked. The Coalition fights wars. They use tactics, precision strikes, energy conservation. They treat combat like a game of chess. Garrick watched a human soldier shoulder charge a vulture, physically knocking the alien brute to the ground before driving a heavy, serrated combat knife through its skull. The humans aren't playing chess. They're just here to break things. The comms console behind them, dead for the last 2 hours, suddenly spat static. Logan jumped, spinning around. "Sir, we're getting a broad-spectrum transmission on the open emergency channel." Garrick rushed to the console. He hit the audio relay. The voice that cut through the static was harsh, deep, and thick with a localized accent that the universal translator struggled to perfectly round off. "New Providence Planetary Defense. This is Commander Wyatt of the 104th Terran Orbital Drop Brigade. Hellhounds. Read you in the blind. If you're still breathing down there, keep your heads down. We're painting the lawn." Garrick stared at the radio. He grabbed the heavy microphone, depressing the transmission key. "Commander Wyatt, this is Outpost Delta. Commander Garrick commanding. We read you. You know you don't have authorization in this sector. The Coalition..." A rough, barking laugh echoed over the frequency. "Yeah, we saw the Coalition retreating on our way in. Tossers almost clipped our port bow trying to jump out of system. Don't worry about authorization, Garrick. We didn't ask." "Why?" Garrick asked. The question tore out of him before he could stop it. "There's no profit here for you. The iridium mines are useless without the trade lanes. Why are you here?" The radio went silent for a moment. Only the background noise of heavy kinetic gunfire and roaring engines bled through the open mic. "We intercepted your distress beacon 4 days ago," Wyatt's voice returned, dropping the casual bravado, settling into something cold and hard as iron. "We heard the council debate on the open frequencies, heard them crunch the numbers and decide your civilians weren't worth the cost of a fleet action. And we don't really like accountants, Garrick. We've been left behind before. We know what it tastes like. So we strapped in, warmed up the drives, and came to teach these bugs a lesson in bad math. Give us 3 minutes to clear your ridge, Delta, then pop your doors. We brought extra ammo." The transmission cut. Garrick stood frozen. He looked back at his squad. The despair that had choked the bunker for the last 2 hours was gone, replaced by a stunned, fragile silence. Outside, the scraping at the door hadn't returned. Instead, a new sound washed over the bunker, the heavy, rhythmic crunch of metal boots on gravel. Garrick walked to the blast door. He looked through the melted hole. The vultures on the ridge were gone, mangled, shattered, and bleeding out. Standing amidst the car was a towering figure in gunmetal power armor. The soldier's visor was polarized black. In one hand, he held a heavy assault rifle. In the other, he was casually reloading a massive sidearm. The human turned his head, looking directly at the melted peephole. He raised 2 fingers to the side of his helmet in a lazy, informal salute. "Logan," Garrick said, his voice trembling for the first time all day. "Open the doors." The magnetic locks disengaged. The heavy blast doors groaned and shrieked as they were pulled open, scraping against the ruined floor. Sunlight, harsh, bright and unfiltered by alien ash, poured into the tomb. Garrick stepped out of the bunker, his squad filing out behind him. The ridge was secure. Below, the valley was a chaotic symphony of violence, but the tide had undeniably turned. The swarm was no longer advancing. For the first time in their existence, they were being pushed back. The humans didn't form neat defensive squares. They didn't retreat to preserve numbers. They advanced, endlessly, brutally. The human soldier on the ridge turned to Garrick. The faceplate slid up with a pneumatic hiss. The man underneath was sweating, his face smeared with grease and soot. He had a ragged scar running down his jaw and a half-chewed cigar clamped between his teeth. "Commander Garrick?" the human asked, spitting a fleck of tobacco onto the dirt. "Yes," Garrick said, standing tall, trying to match the sheer physical presence of the man. The human reached to his belt, unclipped a massive rectangular ammunition tin, and tossed it. Garrick caught it. It was heavy, full of thermal cells and kinetic rounds that would fit the scavenged coalition gear. "Sergeant Cole," the human grinned, a fierce, predatory showing of teeth that somehow felt warmer than any politician's smile. "Looks like you folks are having a bit of a pest problem. Mind if we crash the party?" Garrick looked at the heavy ammo tin. He looked down at the valley, where humanity was single-handedly ripping apart an extinction-level threat out of sheer, unadulterated spite for the universe's indifference. He loaded a fresh cell into his rifle. It clicked into place with a satisfying, full-charged hum. "Sergeant Cole," Garrick said, stepping up to the trench line, feeling the heat of the burning valley on his face. "You are more than welcome." The human laughed, slapped his visor down, and racked his weapon. "All right then, Delta, let's go introduce them to the mud." Garrick had been taught to fight by the book. The Galactic Mandate's tactical manual was a heavily digitized 1,000-page compendium of elegant maneuvers, force conservation, and calculated retreats. It prioritized unit cohesion and shielded formations. The humans hadn't read the book, or if they had, they used it to level wobbly tables in their mess halls. Moving down the ridge behind Sergeant Cole and his squad was an exercise in controlled chaos. They didn't glide from cover to cover, they stomped. Their heavy mechanical boots chewed the mud and pulverized the scattered chitin of dead vultures. There was no stealth. The humans broadcasted their presence with roaring diesel engines, thunderous kinetic gunfire, and a steady stream of profanity that the universal translators struggled to pass into anything resembling military terminology. "Keep tight, Delta," Cole bellowed over his shoulder, slamming a fresh drum magazine into his rotary cannon. "Don't trip over the bugs. If they twitch, shoot 'em again." Garrick fell in line, his newly charged rifle humming in his grip. Finch and Logan flanked him, their posture changing. The paralyzing dread of the bunker was gone, replaced by the frenetic, infectious adrenaline bleeding off the Terran soldiers. Harper limped in the rear, a human wearing a white cross painted crudely over the dents in his chest plate, fell back to walk beside her. He didn't ask for permission. He just grabbed Harper's shoulder, forced her to a halt behind a shattered transport husk, and pulled a wicked-looking auto-injector from his belt. "Hold still," the human grunted. His name tape read Griggs. "What is that?" Harper asked, eyeing the thick, muddy fluid in the syringe. "Coagulant, painkiller, amphetamines, a little bit of battery acid, probably," Griggs said, jamming the needle right through her uniform trousers and into her thigh. Harper gasped, her eyes going wide as the concoction hit her bloodstream. "Walk it off," Griggs said, already turning back toward the firing line. "You've got a city to save." Harper blinked, stamped her injured leg once, and racked the slide of her sidearm. I can't feel my leg." "Can you run on it?" Garrick asked. "I think I could kick a tank over." "Good enough. Move." They hit the outskirts of Arcadia. The city was a sprawling industrial grid, normally humming with the sound of ore processors and transport rails. Now it was a graveyard of shattered glass and twisted plasteel. Black smoke hung low in the streets, trapping the heat and the stench of scorched ozone and burnt flesh. The vultures had adapted. The hive mind, realizing open-field charges against human kinetic weapons were suicidal, had pulled back into the dense urban labyrinth. They were using the architecture. "Contact front!" Logan yelled, pointing up. 3 skittering variants dropped from the ceiling of a ruined tram station, their bladed limbs outstretched, aiming silently for Cole's neck. In the mandate, a squad would have called for covering fire and executed a tactical split. Cole didn't even look up. The human next to him, a short, broad-shouldered woman with a shotgun that looked like a lead pipe welded to a grip, stepped sideways and fired straight up. The roar was deafening in the enclosed street. A cloud of tungsten buckshot caught the falling vultures in midair. The physics were instantaneous and messy. The aliens didn't land. They rained down in ragged, twitching pieces. The woman pumped the action of her weapon with a loud, metallic clack. "Eyes up, dogs!" she shouted, spitting a wad of gum onto the pavement. "They're playing drop bear," Garrick fired, dropping a heavily armored brute that lunged from an alleyway. His thermal bolt took it in the thorax. Before it could fall, a Terran soldier tackled the beast, driving a combat knife into its ocular cluster just to be sure. They moved block by block. It was a meat grinder. The humans took hits. Garrick saw a Terran soldier get pinned by a vulture's crushing mandibles. The armor groaned, alarms blaring as the hydraulic servos fought the alien's grip. The human didn't call for a medic. He pulled a fragmentation grenade from his chest rig, armed it, and shoved it directly into the creature's mouth, kicking himself backward, just as the explosive detonated. The human caught shrapnel in his leg, swore loudly, and let Griggs drag him behind a burned-out transport. "Why do you fight like this?" Garrick asked Cole, as they paused behind a concrete barricade to reload. The street ahead was choked with the smoking husks of dead vultures. Cole wiped sweat and blue blood from his visor. "Like what?" "Like you have nothing to lose." Cole looked at him. The cynical, hard-bitten edge in the human's eyes softened just a fraction, revealing something older and far more tired. "Because we've lost it all before, Commander. Earth, Reach, the Outer Rim colonies. We spent a century getting kicked in the teeth by every hostile species that looked at our borders and saw a soft target. We asked the Mandate for help 70 years ago. Know what they said?" Garrick felt his stomach drop. "They said it was a localized conflict, outside their strategic interest." "Right in one?" Cole smiled, though there was no humor in it. "They let us burn. So we learned to fight in the fire. We don't fight for territory anymore, Garrick. We fight because we absolutely refuse to let the bastards win. Now, where are these civilian shelters?" "Sector 4, Garrick pointed down the main avenue. "Under the central transit hub, 3 blocks. Cole slammed his visor down. "Hellhounds, fix bayonets, we're taking the hub." Garrick watched in stunned silence as the human infantry produced heavy, jagged blades from their rigs and locked them onto the undersides of their rifles. They were intentionally preparing for close-quarters slaughter. It was barbaric. It was primitive. It was exactly what they needed. "With them!" Garrick roared to his squad. Finch let out a battle cry that cracked with exhaustion and adrenaline, charging forward alongside the Terrans. They hit the transit plaza like a sledgehammer. Sector 4 was a slaughterhouse. The plaza surrounding the entrance to the subterranean shelters was a wide, open expanse of cracked pavement and decorative fountains that were now clogged with ash and blue ichor. At the far end, built into the bedrock, were the massive ferrocrete blast doors of the civilian bunkers. Thousands of people were trapped behind them, and between the humans and those doors stood a sea of chitin. The hive mind had concentrated its forces here, recognizing the structural weakness of the shelter doors. A localized swarm, thick as a plague of locusts, was gnawing at the concrete, their acid spittle hissing against the metal reinforcements. "Heavy weapons to the front!" Commander Wyatt's voice crackled over the squad comms. He was directing the air traffic from above, coordinating the drop pods that were still falling on the city perimeter. "They're trying to breach the vault. You have to break that line, Cole." "Copy that, Command," Cole grunted. He looked down the avenue. The swarm was a solid wall of teeth, claws, and armored carapaces. "We don't have the numbers to push that," Logan said, his voice dropping. He had scavenged a Terran assault rifle and was checking the sights. "It's a solid block of them. We hit that, we drown." "Then we drown," Cole said simply. "But we choke them on the way down, suppressing fire, pour it on." The human line opened up. The noise was apocalyptic. Hundreds of kinetic weapons firing simultaneously created a wall of sound that vibrated in Garrick's bone marrow. The front rank of the vultures disintegrated, but the bodies simply became a ramp for those behind them. The humans advanced at a walk, shoulder to shoulder, firing from the hip, firing from the shoulder, reloading with mechanical precision. Garrick marched with them. He fired until his rifle clicked empty, then seamlessly drew his sidearm. Finch was next to him, screaming wordlessly, his fear entirely burned away by the raw, brutal momentum of the Terran advance. They hit the swarm. The battle devolved from a firefight into a brawl. Rifles became clubs. Bayonets sheared through chitin and found the soft, vital organs beneath. Garrick shot a vulture in the face, ducked a sweeping talon, and watched as the human with the shotgun blew the creature in half. The smell was atrocious. Copper, ozone, voided bowels, and the sharp chemical tang of alien blood. They pushed forward, yard by bloody yard. The humans took casualties. A soldier to Garrick's left was dragged into the mass by a cluster of skittering variants. There was a scream, a bright flash of a detonating thermal grenade, and then nothing. The line closed the gap. They didn't stop to mourn. They stepped over the dead and kept killing. "They're too thick," Harper shouted over the comms, limping heavily now, the stims wearing off. "The acid is eating through the shelter doors. They're almost through." Garrick looked past the writhing mass of aliens. The heavy steel of the vault doors was glowing cherry red. The vultures were melting the hinges. Then the ground heaved. It wasn't a drop pod this time. It was something rising from the back of the swarm. A Goliath. It was a siege breaker variant, but older, larger. It stood 3 stories tall, its carapace thick with hardened calcium deposits that deflected the Terran kinetic rounds like raindrops. It had 4 massive trunk-like legs and a torso dominated by a pair of crushing pincers that could snap a main battle tank in half. The hive mind had brought out its executioner. The Goliath let out a roar that shattered the remaining glass in the plaza. It charged, moving with terrifying speed for its size, scattering smaller vultures out of its path. It wasn't aiming for the shelter doors anymore. It was aiming for the human line. "Bring it down!" Cole roared, emptying his rotary cannon at the beast's legs. The uranium rounds sparked uselessly off the heavy armor plating. The Goliath hit the Terran line like a freight train. 10 heavily armored soldiers were thrown into the air, their armor crumpling on impact. The beast snapped its massive pincer, catching a soldier cleanly around the waist, and squeezed. The horrific crunch echoed over the gunfire. "Fall back! Disperse!" Wyatt ordered over the radio. "Negative," Cole spat back. "We give an inch. They take the doors." Garrick watched in horror as the Goliath reared up, preparing to slam its massive forelegs down and crush the center of the defensive line. A human broke from the formation. It was the soldier named Mitchell, the one who had taken shrapnel to the leg earlier. He was limping badly, dragging his right foot. He didn't have his rifle. He held a satchel charge, a brick of high-yield C4 explosive used for breaching heavy fortifications. "Mitchell, get back here!" Cole screamed. Mitchell didn't look back. He sprinted, or hobbled as fast as he could, directly into the shadow of the Goliath. The beast brought its heavy legs down. Mitchell dove, sliding on the bloody pavement, passing straight between the creature's crushing hooves. He rolled to his back directly beneath the Goliath's unprotected, pulsing underbelly. He looked up at the fleshy sacs of volatile acid. He slammed the satchel charge directly onto the membrane, hit the manual detonator, and held it there. He didn't even have time to close his eyes. The explosion was contained, directed entirely upward by the shape of the charge. It didn't just breach the armor, it ignited the hypercorrosive plasma stored within the beast. The Goliath detonated from the inside out. A geyser of blue fire and boiling acid erupted into the sky. The massive creature froze, let out a gurgling, wet shriek, and collapsed in on itself, completely hollowed out by its own weaponized fluids. The shockwave knocked Garrick to his knees. The rain of ash was briefly replaced by a rain of superheated chitin. Silence fell over the plaza, broken only by the crackle of localized fires. The Goliath was dead, and with it, the localized synapse of the hive mind was severed. The remaining vultures stopped. The ferocious, suicidal coordination evaporated. Deprived of their anchor, the smaller creatures suddenly looked around, realizing they were surrounded by dead kin and extremely angry apes. Panic rippled through the swarm. They broke. They turned from the shelter doors and scattered, fleeing into the ruined city, into the sewers, anywhere to escape the kinetic meat grinder. Garrick slowly stood up. His uniform was soaked in mud and alien blood. His hands were shaking. He looked at the smoking crater where Mitchell had been. There was nothing left. Cole walked over to the blast doors. He didn't cheer. He didn't pump his fist. He simply slumped against the reinforced steel, pulling a crushed cigar from a pouch on his vest. He struck a match off his armored thigh, lit the cigar, and exhaled a thick cloud of smoke. "Command," Cole said into his radio, his voice flat and tired. "Sector 4 is clear. Bring down the engineers. We've got civilians to dig out." Garrick walked over to the human sergeant. He looked at the blasted, ruined plaza. The bodies of Terran soldiers lay scattered among the thousands of dead vultures. He knew that charge would kill him, Garrick said quietly, staring at the crater. Cole didn't look at him. He stared out over the ruins of Arcadia. Yeah, he knew. "Why?" Garrick asked, the word feeling heavy in his mouth. "These aren't your people. This isn't your war." Cole took the cigar out of his mouth. He looked at the massive ferrocrete doors behind them, listening to the muffled, terrified weeping of the thousands of souls trapped inside. "Because nobody else was coming, Commander," Cole said softly. "And we know exactly how dark it gets when you realize you're dying alone." The heavy engineering landers touched down in the plaza. They were thick, blocky machines with heavy treads instead of the silent anti-grav drives the Mandate preferred. Men and women in bulky, heat-resistant hazard suits swarmed the melted civilian shelter doors, carrying industrial plasma torches. Garrick sat on a piece of shattered masonry. Harper was slumped beside him, asleep with her head against the stone, the heavy combat stims finally leaving her system and dragging her into unconsciousness. Logan and Finch were quietly helping Terran medics load bodies into heavy black canvas bags. There were so many bags. A loud, metallic crack echoed across the square. The massive hydraulic hinges of the shelter finally gave way under the heat of the torches. The blast doors slowly, agonizingly swung outward, grinding against the pulverized concrete. The air that wafted out was stale, heavy with the scent of unwashed bodies, raw terror, and overworked oxygen scrubbers. A single figure stepped cautiously into the sunlight. It was a local magistrate named Stanton. His pristine, bureaucratic robes were rumpled and stained with sweat. He blinked against the harsh light, squinting past the dust, clearly expecting to see the gleaming silver armor and polished hovering gunships of the Coalition fleet. Instead, he saw a charnel house. He saw mountains of dead vultures, their acid blood turning the pavement into a smoking ruin. And sitting on a pile of rubble just a few yards away, he saw Sergeant Cole, smoking a crushed cigar, his brutalist armor caked in dried blue gore and dirt. Stanton trembled, his eyes wide. Are you the Mandate?" Cole exhaled a thick cloud of smoke. He didn't stand up. "Mandate's gone, pal. Left a few hours ago. We're the janitors. Come to clean up the mess." Civilians began pouring out from the darkness behind Stanton. Thousands of them. Miners, mechanics, teachers, children. They looked at the shattered city, then at the exhausted, battered humans who had held the line. There were no cheers at first, only a stunned, overwhelming silence as they processed the sheer scale of the violence that had been unleashed to keep them alive. A little girl, her face smeared with soot and clutching a dirty stuffed animal, broke from the crowd. She walked straight up to Cole. She didn't flinch at the blood or the terrifying scarred metal of his armor. She just reached out and touched the cold steel of his knee guard. Cole froze. The hardened killer, who had just spent the last 3 hours ripping apart alien monstrosities with a rotary cannon, looked utterly terrified for a brief second. Slowly, carefully, he reached into one of his tactical pouches. He bypassed the spare magazines and the fragmentation grenades, pulling out a sealed, foil-wrapped ration bar. He placed it gently into her small hands. "Chocolate." Cole grunted softly, his voice rough as sandpaper. "Don't tell the quartermaster." The skies above New Providence finally began to clear. The heavy, localized cloud cover was physically dragged away by the massive atmospheric scrubbers of the Terran dreadnoughts holding low orbit. The swarm was entirely broken. Without their Goliaths to anchor the hive mind, the surviving vultures turned on each other in confusion or starved as their collective intelligence collapsed into feral panic. Garrick stood in the makeshift command tent Commander Wyatt had established in the center of the plaza. The hum of portable diesel generators had replaced the endless roar of gunfire. Suddenly, the central communications console lit up. It wasn't the static-filled scramble of the local emergency frequencies. It was a high-band, deeply encrypted channel, the Galactic Mandate. A crisp, holographic projection flickered to life in the center of the tent. Coalition Admiral Vane stood tall in his immaculate, spotless white uniform. His alien features were composed into a mask of practiced, diplomatic neutrality. "New Providence Outpost, this is the Coalition fleet." Vane's synthesized voice filled the tent, perfectly modulated and utterly devoid of emotion. "We have detected a cessation of hostile activity. We are jumping back into the system to re-establish planetary shielding and resume governance. Stand by for orbital tether reconnection." Wyatt, a massive man with a graying beard and a heavily scarred face, stepped in front of the console. He didn't bother adjusting his blood-stained uniform or wiping the grease from his chin. "Coalition Fleet, this is Commander Wyatt of the Terran Systems Alliance. Save your fuel." Admiral Vane's brow furrowed. "Terran, you have no jurisdiction here. This is Mandate territory. We executed a tactical withdrawal. We are returning to claim our colony." Wyatt leaned heavily over the console, staring directly into the holographic eyes of the alien admiral. "You didn't withdraw, you ran. You left 10 million people to get eaten because the math didn't favor your stock portfolios. You are violating galactic treaty, Commander. We will fire upon any unauthorized vessels in the sector." Wyatt laughed. It was a cold, jagged sound that made Garrick shiver. "Admiral, I have 3 dreadnoughts in orbit, 5,000 pissed-off Marines on the ground, and a very itchy trigger finger. Under Article 4 of our own mandate laws, a derelict asset abandoned to hostile forces can be claimed by any party capable of securing it. Wyatt slammed his fist heavily onto the metal console. Earth claims New Providence by right of salvage. If you jump into this system, we won't consider it a rescue mission. We'll consider it an act of war. Turn your shiny ships around and go back to your core worlds. The adults are talking now. Wyatt hit the kill switch. The hologram vanished, plunging the tent back into reality. He turned to Garrick. The local commander was staring in stunned silence. The mandate was the undisputed law of the galaxy. Nobody talked to them like that. Nobody defied them. Well, Garrick, Wyatt sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose and suddenly looking very tired. Looks like you folks are part of the Alliance now. The pay is terrible, the food is worse, but we don't leave our own behind. Garrick looked out the tent flap. He saw human soldiers sharing their canteens and rations with terrified colonists. He saw Terran medics treating wounded mandate soldiers without asking for identification or billing codes. He saw a battered, bloody, beautiful defiance. Garrick reached up, unpinned the silver mandate insignia from his collar, and dropped it into the mud. Where do I sign, Commander? This is exactly why you never calculate the cost of a human life. When the galaxy looked at the numbers and walked away, humanity didn't just break the rules, they broke the entire board. If you felt that cold chill of Terran defiance, hit that like button to honor the hellhounds. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that we don't leave our own behind. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY Sci-Fi stories, where humanity shows the universe exactly what we're made of. See you in the next drop.